All right, we're up to our panel discussion now, so I'll invite those who are on the panel to maybe grab a chair from the front row here and come and turn it round and face towards the audience.
They include, would you prefer to be the moderator or the moderator?
I'll moderate.
Okay, so you're on the panel, Paul. So if you take your chair, and Jenny, please. Jared, are you happy to join the panel? Julian, he's not here. Is he licensed to this? Yes! Gordon, is you back, Gordon?
Ah, great. Come down, Gordon. Thanks.
And Warren Mills.
Yeah, that's you.
So what I'll do...
So do you have the post-it note thing, or did you want to do this differently?
What I'd like to do is to ask Elaine to drag that down there.
You guys are mic'd, so I'll have you guys sit together. I'm mic'd, so you can pass the mic.
In the interest of being succinct, actually around the corner, please, and I'll join you down there in a minute. I want you to write your questions on a post-it note. And so that means you can't use too many words. And we'll collect the questions.
You want to give a little introduction to the others, so that because maybe not everyone knows who everyone is up here.
That is a good idea. Okay, so
They all know me.
do you all want to introduce yourselves, or do you want me to say what I know?
Ooh.
I'll just make it up and say.
So there are some sort of general questions.
Great. Yeah, sure.
And so we'll consolidate your questions and probably make them into, a couple into one, and then we'll bring them up to Matt as being representative of your questions. Because I think now we're on the home straight,
Yep.
and we want to finish.
Want to manage time well. Yep.
What time do we want to finish?
Well, I'd say. Did you want to finish till 6, or did you want to try and finish a bit earlier? Did you want to finish a bit earlier than 6?
Earlier, yeah. Okay.
Let's run this for 3/4 of an hour, and then I'll just do the wrapping up comments at 5:30.
So we'll, if you deal with those questions for a start.
All right. And then you can provide me with questions.
We'll feed you what the crowd want to say.
Sounds great.
And see how that goes.
Excellent. Well, firstly, let's meet our panellists. So, Jared, would you like to tell us who you are?
Sure. I'm Jared Vanderclay. I'm this guy's kid over here. I got into Jordan Peterson all because of him. My primary interest now, aside from I've listened to a couple of his lectures, done the whole book tour thing, but my primary interest is just going out to the meetups, meeting new people, hearing the amazing stories that people have and the way that this process has changed their lives and edited the way they live. So that's really my interest in all this, my exposure to all of this.
Terrific. Thanks. Jenny?
I'm Jenny George. Let me see, about myself.
Yeah, brief summary of who you are.
I'm married to Matt. I run a mental health care company, but I'm not myself a mental health professional. But I must say I have been very interested, and I've noticed not only in the church, but also even in secular society. One of my colleagues went to a Jordan Peterson lecture. I thought, gosh, this is interesting. It is actually making inroads. And so having read the book, I think there's a lot to think about, and I'm really intrigued.
Thanks. Julian.
Yeah, Julian Clark. As you've heard, I'm a long-standing friend of Warren's. In fact, I was best man, as you heard. You said it 3 or 4 times. But at that occasion, I did say to Elaine, don't take him on. He's not a good call. But anyhow...
So you weren't the very best man.
But no, we've been mates for a long, long time, and we argue about all sorts of things. I think the oldest guy in the room, probably, retired, but I'm from the media, so I'm not to be trusted.
Gordon.
I'm Gordon Priest, so I have 3 jobs, all of which are supposed to be 2 days a week, but all of which are want to be full-time. I think I'm partly interested in just the very nature of precariousness in the modern world, and particularly around work. And I think about men in particular in relationship to that. And so I think, I think Peterson's very interesting in terms of that. I think he's got a great sense of finitude and tragedy and all of those sorts of things, and the fall. Maybe could do a bit more resurrection, but I think he's a great contact point.
Great. Thank you, Gordon. And we already have had the pleasure of meeting Paul. Great. So we've got a few general questions to kick us off. And one of those is actually something that was, I think, raised with Paul before, was is Jordan Peterson a secular prophet used by God like King Cyrus? Or should we think of him as, is there a biblical category we can stick him in? I think, Paul, earlier you offered
the unauthorized exorcist.
The unauthorized exorcist, which is a story from the Gospels. Do other people have thoughts about that? Are we talking about someone who is a false teacher that we should just ignore or set aside or label that way, or should we be seeing him as actually being an instrument of God? So do you want to kick us off with that, Gordon?
Yeah, I think he's a wise man. I think he's a secular wise man. And I guess interesting, the choice of Ecclesiastes for the readings. I think the wisdom literature in the Bible basically it's not so much the big moments of salvation history, it's more kind of empirical analysis and looking at patterns in creation that give order to life. And so you've got rules of life, like the Proverbs, for instance, etc. He uses a lot of Proverbs, kind of his own, and pithy little stories. Ecclesiastes and Job are kind of anti-wisdom in a way. They say that the rules don't always work out. So there's more mystery than just mastery in life. So I think there's an interesting tension there. But I think as you go on with him, I think it starts simple and he nuances it all the way through. So it gets more and more complex. Then he comes back to he sort of ends with the one line of So I think wisdom is probably the category that he wise guy.
Thanks, Gordon. Well, I'm drawn to that scripture, by their fruits you shall know them. And I mean, it's very difficult, almost impossible for us to clearly define what we consider to be, how we describe being sacred. And he doesn't fit what you would normally call as sacred. But I think he's doing God's work. And I'm not sure that he knows that. And I think one of the prevailing things about him as I watch him is that he's on a journey. He's on a big, long journey. He knows it. And he's still working out where he is on that journey. And so I would think watch his space. But in the meantime, I think he's just doing a fantastic job. And you can't have all of these young people saying, you've turned my life around, and describe him any other way than a good factor.
Thanks.
I think the thing that strikes me the most is his insistence on truth. And I think that that's incredibly useful. And it's self-correcting, which is the thing I like about it the most, because as long as you insist on truth, even going down the right path still enables you to self-correct. And that, to me, I think is an incredibly helpful thing. Personally, I think at the moment, he hasn't quite read the Bible right yet. And I don't know that he's figured out Jesus. That's just my personal... in particular, I think that he's missing some really profound revelation, transcendent revelation, if you like, that I think that Jesus brings, and I think he hasn't, that's not factored into his thinking yet. But I think his insistence on honesty and insistence on following the truth, it means that, who knows, watch this space.
Thank you.
Well, everything that we've talked about today, I think, points to the fact that that people are willing to show up to meet, to talk about Peterson within the Christian perspective shows that there is something there. And I think it's probably fair to say that the church has neglected in some areas the regions that he's taken on. The church has not always done a great job engaging with the culture in a productive way in the realms of atheism, in the realms of the questions that he's been answering. And regardless of what his stance on Christianity is, he may be straddling the fence on God 1 and God 2. but he's bringing other people to the line, and those people are getting the opportunity to step over from God 1 into belief in God 2, when otherwise the church never would have brought them in. So call them what you want, but I think it's been a good thing.
Thank you.
I don't know what the question is, but I'm going to say what I'm going to say.
It's never stopped you before. Thank you.
I think Peterson's gift to me was his suggestion that the Logos is the living word. Of course, he refers to Jesus as the embodiment of the living word. And he said that each of us has a living word. And it's what we have to say, what we think is true. Not just off the top of our head, but what we deeply believe to be true on the basis of what we've tested in our lives and have experienced to be true. And he said, you must speak your truth. I found that incredibly powerful. And so I did, and my world blew up, and I ended up here.
Thank you. All right, Warren, I'm going to make a call here, and I'm going to ditch your Dorothy Dixer questions because we've got great questions from the group, and I want to make sure we answer where they've come from the audience. So, terrific. How do other religions fit into a Christian worldview? Is one of the questions here. I might start with Gordon on this, if that's all right.
I think this
Mike?
like in the session I had after the morning session, I think I talked a bit about myths and philosophies, and you could extend that into other religions too. So let's say like C.S. Lewis's Law of Tao that he has the end of, I'm trying to remember the title of Abolition of Man, which is designed for school curriculum actually in the sort of end years of high school. And he draws parallels around, let's say, the first half of the Ten Commandments, for instance, and sees that as being relatively universal in that. But I think another way of looking at it is in terms of he and Tolkien, after the First World War, with the total devastation of that, when they lost best friends, and Lewis ended up, raising his best friend's mother in some ways, or looking after her. And then they were into Norse mythology and things like that. And the idea was that the myths, and Peterson deals a lot with myths, and myths are meaning systems, asking big questions. They're not untrue, but they're truths expressed in a certain sort of way. And Lewis struggled with that for a long time with rationality, as the, in trying to rationalise that. And Lewis ended up being converted as they were coming home, probably from the pub where they used to always meet, walking and home around midnight. And Tolkien basically said that all these great Norse myths and other things, and you could include other religions too. I think is it Peter Kreeft, the great Catholic apologist, does this. He's got a little diagram illustrating all of it. And that the incarnation and the death and resurrection of Jesus ends up historicising all of those. It's yes, you do have myths about incarnation in other religions, etc., but nothing's really got the cross and nor the resurrection, and it does depend on history in the end. It absolutely depends on history. If you're going to talk about reality, you cannot avoid history, and that's the bottom line, and that's where all the tragedy of life and suffering of life that Peterson talks about turns comic in the end. And all the movies are written that way. That's the basic arc of you start with innocence, you have tragedy, fall, complications, and then you have some form of redemption.
So you're saying there's the other religions, there may be some correspondences of the story that they tell to the Christian story, but in the end they lack the concreteness of happening in history of the incarnation.
And resurrection.
Right.
The
automatic question that follows from that question is, well, how does God deal with people who are either way outside of any religion or not in the right religion? And that's a complicated, complex question. And it's... You get to the point where you say, well, all I can deal with is what I can deal with in my own, not only my own intellect, but the environment in which I've grown up. And if you're honest about all of these things, the environment that you grow up has a huge impact on where you are in this whole spectrum from, from 0 to 10. Mm-hmm. And so we've got to leave this to God, this whole question. And one of the things that I've come to be a much more open about since I've been watching, and including you too, Paul, but certainly watching Peterson, is that what you thought was probably absolutely locked away and never to be discussed again isn't actually that way. Now, that doesn't mean that you get rid of all of the things that you consider to be the major building blocks of the wall in which you trust. Mm-hmm. But it encourages you to keep an open mind and keep working these things through your mind. But at the end of the day, for Christianity for me, but I grew up in it, I know no other religion, it offers me something that gives me solace and determination that I get nowhere else.
Thank you. I'm gonna. We won't all have everyone answer every question because the questions are coming faster than you guys are talking about them. So we'll get behind it. I'm going to. So maybe just one or two people for each question, and put your hand up if you're dying to give an answer to a particular one. Let's go to an easier, perhaps, question or a different nature. What book would you recommend? What would be your number one book to recommend to read alongside Peterson's videos or books, and let's say aside from the Bible, because I don't want you all to use up your answer for that. So let's say you read the Bible and Peterson's books. What would be the number one thing that you want to read alongside it?
For what is it just a general?
Yeah, just what would you recommend for someone in general to read? Yeah, so not knowing anything specific about the person.
About the meaning of life or cricket? Or?
Let's say it's got a counterpoint view that's helpful to Peterson and something relevant. Jenny?
Yeah, look, I was talking earlier with Paul. There's a Christian, now a Christian thinker called René Girard. Many of you may have heard of him. His views, particularly on sacrifice and suffering, have got a lot of resonance, but a distinctly different take and a distinctly different way of reading the Bible, and particularly of seeing the revelatory power of the cross and resurrection. And I think that for me anyway, I'm still working through what I think of the juxtaposition of them with each other, and I kind of wish René was still alive to have a conversation with Jordan Peterson, because I think it would be interesting on both sides.
Thanks. Jared?
I don't think I've read nearly as much as some of the other people on this panel, so might not be the most experienced answer, but Les Miserables, that book's my favorite, easily. And I think it twists a lot of the narrative that the world presents, and that's some of the similar stuff Peterson does. I think that's helpful.
Yeah, right. Alternative story.
If I were you, I would read my book.
When I began the Peterson journey, I knew I wanted a guide who could walk with me with Peterson, and I picked C.S. Lewis. And many of his books are terrific. And I would also say, pick the one that grabs your interest. It's probably not a bad way to start.
Okay, great. Let's move on. Here's another kind of question. Why does Peterson provoke such fear, especially in the left of politics? Is he Hitler?
He hates
I'm just
Nazis.
reading.
I think the whole identity thing and staking your positions, making them identity issues, is not only left, but it's also right. I think that operates on both sides. I think there is. I think it's because of that, because people are investing their personality in certain kinds of concepts and often they're linguistic concepts. You know, you go online and you've only got to use certain trigger words and people explode. And like on our website, I'd say we basically try to use steel men and women arguments, and stole the concept from someone recently. Or I sort of thought, yeah, I like that. So you want to get the best positions you can, and then get some discussion about those. But every now and then there'll be a trigger word, and someone will say, "Gordon, you said this." I said, "This is not my opinion page." You know, it's kind of and have to try and get the guy who does it for me to put further distance between me and so it doesn't look like it's coming out of my mouth when it's on the page. But there is this extraordinary kind of thing, I think, where people identify and they're tribal, and we can't have decent dinner table conversations any longer. The lack of civility, all of those sorts of things. And people are just willing to, you know, one picture of Peterson with a guy who's got a jacket on that says, you know, I'm Islamophobic and proud of it. And I had someone who basically, you know, in my network and who's not here today because his daughter, who's a psychologist, basically, you know, said, "Look at this, that's terrible, how can you be involved in this," etc., etc. And so I got my guy who, you know, is good with the web. He went around and checked out. He saw the original set of photos. There are about 100 there, and there's this, you know, people all looking very normal. One person with that, and he also tried to check out whether it was fake or not. And so that cost him access to Cambridge University, etc., etc. So I think, yeah, we've got to try and stand up to that in, you know, where we can. And, yeah.
So one thing I've noticed is that in the last maybe 10 to 20 years is that ideas have gone from being things that we talked about to being things that we brand ourselves with. And it feels like, I don't think it's just a problem for the left, it may also be a problem for the right, that they're just grabbing ideas for personal branding purposes rather than to hold them a bit at arm's length and discuss them honestly and with a bit of openness to learning. Jenny?
Yeah, I think that one of the things Peterson says that really resonates and that I think is actually... so it resonates with me, but I think it is something that is a genuine kind of disagreement, perhaps with very progressively on the left, is he's genuinely telling us, says it in these words, I believe, let's not throw out institutions that have served us well in the past. And so, you know, it has taken thousands, millions, billions of years for us as a human species to get to this point. And there's a reason why our society has been organised this way and has got to this point and has institutions like marriage and other things. And I think that that resonates with a lot of people, but I think it is quite confronting, and I think that it is a genuine difference of opinion. So I think that there's branding issues with the left, there's word issues with the left, but I suspect there are also genuinely ideological differences that are about a conservative, in the true sense of the word, conserving the, you know, what has come to us versus a progressive difference.
Thank you. Okay, let's try another one. I've got one specifically for Paul here. Can you interpret, I don't even know what this means, so you're going to have to tell me what it means first. Can you interpret Jordan Peterson's dream of hanging on a chandelier in a church?
No.
See, that was efficient.
I will say something about who he is and his mystical side. Peterson clearly is an individual that has visions and dreams, and you have to sift through a great deal of audio, video and audio material to hear him talk about them. He doesn't forefront them, but that is a real factor in his life, and it is also probably the reason why if he won't directly answer questions about the resurrection, because he's had enough experience to know that life is stranger than Sam Harris believes.
Very good.
Thank you. This is an interesting one. I'm not 100% sure I understand it, but I'll see if you guys do. I think it might be driven by a specific situation. So if you're the author of this question, and you don't have to, but if you'd like to explain further where it's coming from, that might be helpful. If you are in a corrupted hierarchy, is it okay to lie to get out of it and into a new one? It may be driven by a particular circumstance. Does someone wish to speak, or do they just want to leave it theoretical? Sorry. Yep.
So let's say you're in a workplace and you want to get to a new workplace, everything around it and in your day-to-day interactions, whether it's the culture, all these sorts of things, and you know the right path is to get out of it, but if you were to just omit that truth to everyone around you in that workplace, perhaps they'll remove you on that day, and you've kind of put yourself into a bad position where you're not quite ready for this new role yet, or you've still got to cross some T's and dot some I's. But to just kind of keep them at bay until your path is clear, is it okay to omit truths or? So
you're omitting, like not saying everything you think with lying? Are you holding those two things together, or would you make a distinction?
In a situation where they directly ask you, are you looking for opportunities elsewhere?
Right.
Hypothetical, guys.
Okay. Yeah.
I have a friend.
So the friend of a friend who's in this terrible situation and is being asked by his employers if he's looking for a new job when he is but doesn't want to say so, is it okay to lie about it?
Okay, I was working out my answer on all the preface till that was said at the last minute, but which changes it considerably, I think. Let's just sort of lay out the field about truth-telling a bit. Truth-telling isn't always the whole truth. It depends on the context and whether it's fitting or not. Now, that's not situation ethics or relativism. Bonhoeffer practiced that under the Nazis, for instance, and to whatever extent he was involved in the conspiracy against Hitler, he still had to keep secrets. And his view was that we need to practice reticence. He was the son of the foremost anti-Freudian psychiatrist in Germany, and he had a strong sense of reticence. So he talked about God clothes our nakedness after the fall. We need clothing. We shouldn't just stand bare like a lot of people want to do on the net or the web or in all sorts of situations where it's frankly unsuitable and it's dishonouring. Now we shouldn't certainly lie directly. There may be ways of deflecting certain things rather than lying directly, and we need to work things out in terms of that. When it's just self-interest, I think you may want to postpone something until you're in a position you may be able to answer that directly at a certain point. So that might be appropriate in certain situations. And it's also, see, if you've got confidences from people, for instance, this is why, if someone was to ask me, I don't want you to ever tell anyone about this, and they don't tell you what it's going to be, I'm not going to say. I'm not willing to do that. I'm not going to make that kind of vow, because they might tell me they're about to kill their wife or something, if you're in a counselling situation or whatever. So there's a lot about wisdom and what is fitting. Like we say, a door is true to the door jamb that it's in. We're talking about it being fitting in that sort of context. So we need to make those judgments as well as the facts. We need to think through those issues. But I haven't answered.
And perhaps to go in with Warren's book plug, you might consider what's loving in the circumstance to actually be an ethic that drives you rather than just saying everything that's in your head. Jenny's a CEO of a large organisation, so she's got employees who might sometimes be in this situation. What would you hope that they would do?
Yeah, good question. I actually think, and I'm going to go, I think Peterson's advice is excellent, by the way, and in terms of the 12 rules. However, sometimes in some situations, the rules somewhat overlap. And so there's truth-telling. There's also potentially looking in the situation where you are now and what is the right thing to do to improve that and to do the best you can. So, what I would say in that situation is some kinds of answers are going to sound to the rest of your colleagues like whinging and or kind of really talking down the situation and kind of saying, I hate this, and actually quite counterproductive. However, a direct lie is also not helpful. It's not going to improve the situation. It's not good for you as a person. And so somewhere in there, there's going to be a way of trying to manage that situation, which is which is both thinking about how best to build up and be a positive influence in the situation where you happen to actually be right now. You haven't moved yet, you're still there, and it might be a nightmare, but actually maybe you calling it and saying it's a nightmare is actually not helpful and it's not progressing that particular situation. But on the other hand, you also don't want to be untruthful and pretend that's not true either. So I think it's a judgment call about how best to apply those things, but I think that truth that also disregards the effect that your words will have on other people and the effect that that might have is also not properly playing out what will happen, and I think both need to be there. And it might be that you tell the truth but in a very particular way to a very particular person who's the right person to hear it, and don't just kind of go, oh, well, truth-telling means I have to walk around this workplace telling everyone how much I hate it and that I'm leaving when I can, which I don't think is necessarily the answer either.
If you're looking for a solid story precedent for times when you might not say the entire truth, read the story of Jesus in the lead up to his crucifixion, in his trials. And like a lamb before his shearers was silent. And are you the Son of God? You say so. Right? You don't have to actually say everything at the same time. All right, let's move on. If a non-Christian Peterson fan is interested in faith, what do you suggest that they do next? What should they do if they're interested in faith, they're currently not a Christian but into Jordan Peterson? Maybe, Jared, do you want to kick us off?
Thanks for getting me the easy question.
Repent and believe the gospel. Oh, sorry.
It's a hard topic to broach simply because it's so integral to your identity. And it's hard to tell someone how to act in that regard. I think the best thing you can do is just to listen to what they have to say. Why this is important, why they think this is an area they want to approach. Listen, they may give you the answer already. They may walk it out for you to begin with. But
Oh, sorry. What advice would you give to the person themselves, the non-Christian person themselves who's interested in faith?
listen to, what advice are you going to give them? Yeah. Well, first, you have to listen to them. Go to church, meet people, talk to people, hear their stories, hear how faith has impacted their lives in ways that you maybe never understood before. Feel out what it would be like. I mean, I think there's a difference between wanting to want to be a Christian and wanting to be a Christian. So feel out the differences and take some steps in that direction and see where it leads you.
Thanks, Jared. Maybe Paul, do you want to answer that question too? First?
I get this question regularly. I ask them what they've been doing already. And usually they've been trying some things, and most of the time I will encourage them to find a church or find a Christian that they respect and to begin to build a relationship.
Great, thank you. All right, next one. Has Jordan Peterson's anti-ideologue stance become an ideology in itself for him or for his followers? Who wants to start that one off? See, there's a time for silence. I told you. Gordon, thanks.
I think he needs to be fairly careful on the kind of roller coaster he's on in some ways. So I think that the illustration of the guy standing next to him with the I'm proud to be an Islamophobe hater, Islamophobe, is an example, and because I think I said to my friend, he needs a good minder. We talked about sort of institutionalisation, and I think he needs to build some institution around him. He's obviously doing some of that, but there was obviously a slip up too. And he's now talked about ways he'll correct that. It'll cost him money, but he'll have to do that. He's got enough money now. I think there are some issues. Certainly, some have concerns, and one of his previous colleagues that you put that clip up about from the Star article and that.
Yeah, Bernie Schiff.
But didn't go into it much. But we put that up next to our other article to have two sides up, and decided all publicity is good publicity in some way. We would try and generate some interest in this, and I'm not particularly taking sides in terms of that, but the point that was being made there, that part of it was concerned that with his study of totalitarianism over so long, that he had actually perhaps adopted some methods of demagoguery. Now, there's certainly some celebrity, like all the photos and that I have concerns about some of that, and some of that can turn kind of ideological or in a demagoguery kind of way. That I think he needs good people around him who, besides his wife, who he seems to really respect in that way, who will really speak truth to him about some of those things.
Yeah, I think we may massively underestimate, firstly, he's just a human being who's been quietly doing his thing in a university. Suddenly, all this thing is happening, and the psychological load that he's under is actually quite immense. And he may not have been prepared for it fully, for all his wisdom that he has. So, yeah. Paul.
Peterson himself defines an ideology as a crippled religion. And I think there is a danger, given the cult status that he has achieved. And I don't purposely, boy, that's a tough, I can't look into his heart. But there is a way in which his movement could itself become a sort of crippled religion. And part of that, I think you're right, that he's vulnerable to it because he has not given enough thought to institution around him. As opposed to, say, someone like Billy Graham, who gave a lot of thought to institution, a lot of thought to how he needed to safeguard himself from the temptations of money and fame, and also then how the people that come into his wake can actually be shepherded and cared for. And Billy Graham did that well.
Yes, and Billy Graham had the benefit of 200 years of precedence of Christian revival tent meetings.
That's right.
And to learn from all the ways it's gone wrong.
That's right.
By those exact things.
There's a sense of adulation too when you go to these meetings, which worries me a little bit, because I think it's hard for the guy to handle it. I don't think he likes it personally, but it's there, standing ovations. I saw it firsthand here in Melbourne. And again, the guy's genuine and he's humble. You'll get through it, but there's the danger there, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's quite twisting. Jared?
The one thing Jordan Peterson doesn't really have in this respect is, I think, one thing that Christianity has, and that's the idea of sin. And sin is that we're all fallen, we all make mistakes, we all miss God's will, and we all fail in that regard. And Peterson, without that certainty that he will not be absolutely correct, I could see, even though right now he's been humble, he's acted within bounds, I could see his movements, or potentially even him, falling under the idea that they've cracked the code, they've found perfection in the end result. But yeah, Christianity has that little twist that he's stepping around.
Yeah, thank you. We'll move on to the next one. This is quite an insightful question, asking us to make a distinction. In our relationships with other people, how do we make good judgments without succumbing to judgmentalism? Warren, off you go.
Read my book. No, I'm serious. A lot of years ago, my younger brother called me a hypocrite for very good reason. And then later, when I was reading the gospel text that talks about taking the mote out of your own eye before you take the splinter out of someone else's eye, was deeply convicting. And then there was another occasion where my wife and I were facing a huge crisis, and I can't tell you the story because it would take too long, but I decided that everything that had gone wrong was my wife's fault. And then in a moment of pure rational insight, I realised that even if I was right, it wouldn't make anything better. It would only make things worse if I was to say that. I think the golden rule is the principle: to treat others as you would like to be treated. And so before we rush to judgment, we ask ourselves the question, would we like to be judged in this way? And almost always the answer is no. So the golden rule is a very simple concept. And I mention in my book that there's an American philosopher whose name has just escaped my mind, who says that the golden rule is a double universal. Everybody believes it and nobody does it. And I think that's approximately true. And it's extremely hard to do. It's a very elegant idea, and we all say, oh yeah, that's a good idea, that's a good ethical principle, but it's extremely hard to do because you have to stop, put yourself into that other person's position and say, would I want this to come to me? And if the answer is no, don't do it.
What if the answer is yes?
If the answer is yes, well, that's always the answer when I'm dealing with you. No, well, the answer sometimes is yes, and you have to have some hard decisions. But I think there's a difference, hard conversations, but there's a difference between a hard conversation and condemning someone or judging them.
Yeah, this was a really interesting thing. Jordan Peterson's quite thoughtful and definite, actually, about the wisdom of choosing the right friends. You know, that's a very distinctive thing he says, which is very ancient wisdom, and yet we don't actually hear it a lot, because that's not the kind of thing that we say because it sounds judgmental. And yet actually we all choose our friends, actually. It's not that we can spend time with everyone in the world, we just can't do that. And so I think when you redefine the word judgment a little bit and you say we are all making choices and we're all making decisions, and good judgment is about making choices that are healthy and wise. And good choices don't have to include judgmentalism, which I suppose is where we are then implying something about the choice that we've made that is condemning or in some sense making well, we are of course making a moral judgment probably in some of those cases too, but it's something about our own hearts, I think, is what's being implied by that word judgmentalism. So I think we shouldn't shy away from making good choices. And I think that what we have to guard against is whether or not along with that comes a sense of superiority or of something that is actually quite an ugly attitude in ourselves as we do that.
Part of the difficulty is that the word judgment encompasses everything from discernment for myself to condemnation of you. And so that end of it, that's discernment of ourselves, you're supposed to do that all the time. But condemnation of you is a very different thing, and we want to really hold back from that, which is what Warren and Jenny have made very clear. Thank you. Do you think that Jordan Peterson will end up giving himself to Christ? Is anyone a prophet or the son of a prophet?
So if you haven't heard about it, I mentioned it already earlier. Jordan Peterson gave the convocation at Liberty University. It was, I hope the video gets made public. Some other versions are out there on Facebook and such. It's a fascinating video to watch. I don't know what God will do with Jordan Peterson. That's God's business. I think the contributions he's making are leading to a fully integrated system where we could imagine understanding that Warren asked me the other night, how has this Jordan Peterson journey changed me? It has made me more sure of the historical resurrection, because I understand why Jesus had to walk out of the tomb more now than I did 2 years ago, because of Jordan Peterson. And that is ironic for a man who, in one of the Vancouver lectures, when Sam Harris is bearing down on him, had to answer the question, did Jesus Christ walk out of the tomb? Almost certainly not. Sam Harris kind of positioned him to answer. Jordan Peterson walked that back later. I don't know what will happen with Peterson. A lot of people see him on a journey. If you listen to what he's been saying for the last 20 years, it hasn't changed much. It could be that this new intense environment he's in now will force some changes that we haven't seen in his previous 20 years.
I think I can probably speak for all of the Christians on the panel when I say we hope so, but we don't know. I don't know this author, I haven't read them. Jonathan Pageau?
Jonathan Pageau.
Pageau, okay. Beyond metaphor, Jonathan Pageau speaks of the symbolic world. What does Pageau shed light on beyond what Jordan Peterson can do with his categories?
Jonathan Pageau is an Orthodox icon carver who grew up evangelical, went into the Roman Catholic Church, and then finally settled in the Orthodox tradition. Jonathan and his brother Matthew, that's the Englishized version of his name, they're both French Canadians, have been developing a very interesting approach to the Bible, rejuvenating the symbolism that church fathers worked. And he became a personal friend of Jordan Peterson before Jordan Peterson's status rocket ride, because he heard Jordan Peterson on Ontario Public Television and saw how both Jordan Peterson via Jung and Pageau via church fathers understood what is, in a sense, this gets a little philosophical, Aristotle's formal cause. That reality is probably best understood that a tree can be a spoon or a chair or a table by virtue of the mind that is imposing the form upon it. That particular philosophical approach to reality opens up the Bible in a lot of new ways that have been forgotten or ignored really until more recent moves by, let's say, Robert Alter and other literary critics of the Bible. Northrop Frye is a huge influence on Jordan Peterson. And what this means, for example, when I'm preaching now through the Gospel of Mark and Jesus passes by the sea, I complain about the NIV that translates it lake, because that sea symbolically connects us with the tohu wavohu of Genesis 1, with the Leviathan that you can find in the wisdom literature, and this rich symbolic interpretation that has been preserved by the Orthodox Church is something that can very much help, I think, traditions that continue to embrace the Bible as authoritative, communicate the beauty of the Bible to a world that is skeptical about the 19th century categories of literalism. And so Pageau has been an incredibly important person in this entire revival. And people keep asking him, you know, when are you going to read Jung? And he says, I'm not going to. I read the church fathers. And that drives one segment of the Jordan Peterson following mad.
Great, thank you. What have we discussed today that we can apply to winning those on the left, it says, who are as religious as we can be, in brackets, arguably? Sounds like someone's having a debate with themselves on the post-it note. What have we discussed today that we can apply to winning those on the left who are religious like us? I'm not sure what we're winning them to at this point, but anyone want to have a go with that?
Religious in their ideology. They can be quite religious in the way they approach.
Oh, religious in their left-wing politicsness, not in their Christianity.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So winning people who have strong religious zealousness for their left-wing politics. How can we learn from today to be winsome towards them?
I think this is part of the movement. When you look at individuals like the Weinsteins and even myself, I, in my denomination, was very solidly a person on the left of the Christian Reformed Church. That probably still puts me on the right of the Americans. But I started this journey before Jordan Peterson because I began listening to those further on the left saying, what really is happening to your gospel? And many of the categories have changed. And when I'd hear people saying, you have to listen to people of color, as if all people of color, which is the vast majority of people on the earth, think the same thing. And this thing just didn't hold together. And I think for many people, at some point, they're going to have, things are simply going to come apart if they keep following this identity pathway. It isn't going to hold. And that's part of the reason of my optimism. At some point, they're not going to be able to put together strong enough coalitions. And at that point, maybe they'll look for something more solid.
But if one of the assumptions, sorry to follow up, if one of the assumptions is that Peterson's teaching is bringing people to us within the church, can we then extend upon that and say, well, the left aren't going to come in, does that mean we have to go?
How will we actually connect to the left? Gordon, you might have a few thoughts about this. So ethos is trying to connect to people with a variety of philosophical outlooks.
Yeah, you could say the Uniting Church has tried very hard to connect with the left. Some would say it's the Greens at prayer, but they haven't really come in.
But the church has gone out.
Yeah, I think we need to reflect some sense of respect and good faith in the ways we deal with people. And we have an ongoing dialogue with Arena, which is perhaps Australia's leading left-wing think tank. We produced a book last year that based on Charles Taylor. It's called On Religion. It's 300 and something pages. And that was sort of three of us as Christians and three who were, they're not hardline Marxists, but they would be of the left. And we had fantastic conversations over a long period of time. We'd like another project to work on in some ways. I think an emphasis on Peterson stuff about action and deed is important. People will really want to see that. Belonging. People on the left are supposed to take seriously community. I think that's a thing that we can offer. I think to deconstruct certain abstract sorts of things and say, well, where does this point actually come from? Like people on the left, particularly if they're from the humanities and done cultural studies, etc., deconstruction, Foucault, all of that. It's supposed to be one of the big things they do, but people really do it to themselves. So I think that's something to be done, and to point out some of the weaknesses. Like for instance, I've done a lot of work in areas that are in parishes that have high unemployment levels, etc., and been part of projects that try and help people transition. And I'm reasonably green, but I'm particularly interested in how do you transition areas that are deindustrialised, so people don't go and join up with Trump, for instance. Because Democrats and techno-utopians and others, they only stick to the coast and other areas and then abandon the middle of manufacturing areas. And I think our Greens are like that. They're pretty much inside the tram tracks, and they don't take seriously what it's like to live in Gippsland and have your power station close on you, or in Queensland when they say, well, the Adani issue. This is the Labor Premier. Says this is all about jobs. Well, unless someone actually does take seriously the job issue, Adani doesn't provide jobs, coal isn't going to provide that many jobs, etc. But some of those things need to be pointed out in relationship to those groups as well. Yeah.
So they don't feel like we're sacrificing them. I've got 4 more questions I need to get through, so let's keep pushing on because we're already 5 minutes over what we promised. So just to be clear, Paul and Jordan Peterson are saying that meaning is action, not something esoteric. Is that like a point of clarification from what you said before?
It's a good question. Jordan Peterson basically says we are built for meaning, biologically, and that's why meaning is such a reliable compass for us. But what exactly is meaning? Boy, that's hard.
Yeah.
We experience it, we sacrifice for it, but what is it? It's sort of like, what is glory? Well, we know it, we taste it, we're drawn to it. The world was made for it, but what exactly is it? Is it a light bulb? No, it's
A vapor and a chasing after wind, perhaps. Yeah, great. So Christ said that people would come to salvation by witness of unity, experiencing love, and seeing the Lord's power, which is summarising a few biblical ideas. Where does Peterson fit in with that way of, like, that people, if that's how people come to salvation, how could Peterson fit with that, if at all?
Can I have a go at that?
Yeah, thanks, Warren.
The first 3 suggestions were?
Oh, so they were picking up a few things. So witness of unity,
Yes.
like when Jesus talks about oneness, I assume they're referring to. Experiencing love,
Yes,
you'll know they're my disciples, and seeing the Lord's power.
yes. That's the golden rule. I'm serious. It's absolutely the golden rule.
So where does Jordan Peterson, if that's how people are going to come to salvation, where does Jordan Peterson fit in with that?
That wasn't supposed to be a reference to my book, please.
It was a coincidence, yeah.
I think Peterson dances around the issue. I wish he was so succinct, but he's certainly not there to make such a comprehensive statement. He's perfectly capable of it, doing it as a rationalist, as a scientist. I think he dances around it. He talks about aiming for the highest good for yourself and others. His definition of good is to do what's right, not just for you and one other person, but for your network, for your family, and for the common good, not just for this moment or tomorrow, but for the longest possible period. That's the definition of love. And of course, it's identical to the definition of good. And so he skirts around it. I wish he would be so succinct. If you want to see... No, that's enough.
Yeah, thanks, Warren. Read Warren's book if you want to know more. Is Peterson's idea of the city of God, perhaps this is a quick one for you, Paul, to deal with, is the city of God in Peterson simply another postmodern construct, given that meaning resides within the individual?
No. Warren alluded to Peterson's treatment of the Piaget's equilibrated state. That, for Peterson, is the city of God. That is, and it is very much what Warren is saying. It is the golden rule. It is love and goodness all the way out this way to everyone around you, and all the way into the future and into the past. Peterson, another person that doesn't get enough attention via Peterson, is Piaget. But Piaget is absolutely central to Peterson.
Okay, thank you. And finally, what action do you recommend to take to be a better Christian rather than a better Petersonian, if that's a thing? Final one. What action would you recommend to take to be a better Christian rather than a better Petersonian? Perhaps thinking about the golden rule. I'm just,
I think take up your cross and follow Jesus.
Thank you.
The gospel doesn't say take up your cross and follow Jordan Peterson.
Right. Yeah. Gordon?
My wife does a lot of work with people with mental illness. She trains carers, and she has a phrase which is holding the hope. I think our role is like the 4 men who took their mate up to the roof. and then
The paralytic that was lowered through
the paralytic
roof
and
to Jesus.
loading through the roof. And in the, when Jesus says your faith has healed you or something, it's actually in the plural. So we don't actually know whether he actually had much faith himself personally.
Yeah.
And I think we're in that kind of state in our culture at the moment. And I think that requires patience as well as hope. Those two virtues are directly related. So I want to kind of add that to love. I wish you'd stay on message, Warren. Make a great Polly. So yeah, let's say faith, hope and love. Yeah, I think to embody some of that and really hold that
Great.
for the world, I think is incredibly important.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all our panellists. It's been enriching to have all your wisdom and insights. I'm just going to quickly, thank you. Let's give you a round of applause. If you'd like to take your chairs and turn them back around, and I'll occupy this space again just to finish us off with a bit more Ecclesiastes and some thoughts about what next. In chapter 9, the teacher in Ecclesiastes tells us to make the most of our empty lives before they disappear. There is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom among the dead, he says, and death will come at random, so just make the most of them while you can. So I'm going to read that, and then we'll move on to chapter 12. Go, eat your bread with enjoyment, and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has long ago approved what you do. Let your garments always be white. Do not let oil be lacking on your head. Enjoy life with the wife whom you love all the days of your vain life that are given to you under the sun, because that is your portion in life and in your toil at which you toil under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all your might, for there is no work or thought or knowledge or wisdom in Sheol, to which you are going. Again, I saw that under the sun, the race is not to the swift, nor the battle to the strong, nor bread to the wise, nor riches to the intelligent, but time and chance happen to them all. So we sit with that, and then we find that to conclude the book, the teacher says this: now all has been heard. Here is the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for that is the duty of all mankind. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. I don't know what you think of that. I think this is an unsatisfying conclusion to Ecclesiastes. It's an orthodox, solid Jewish conclusion. Maybe that's why they kept it in the Bible, because the rest of it's a bit out there, right? You know, guys, notwithstanding everything that I've just said, fear God and keep his commandments. He's okay. But intellectually, he hasn't left room for this, has he? He's argued really thoroughly that he does not see life work out justly, that if you just observe things, people aren't really accountable for what they do. Wicked people are getting away with it. Good people are losing out. And so although he restates his belief in judgment, that God will bring every deed into judgment, he has not given us a time when it will happen. Who knows, he asks earlier, if there is anything after death? He doesn't know. So he's not working with that. So he's done his thinking assuming that death is death. Life is a vapor, he says. It's a mist that vanishes. Life is elusive, and so meaning for it is just as elusive. You can't grab it. And he began with the only conclusion he could make from that observation. Vanity of vanities. Everything is vanity. Everything is empty. Life properly observed cannot sustain meaning. He has found the limits of the quest for meaning if the end of life is death. But what if it isn't? What if death is not the end of life? In one of his letters, the Apostle Paul devotes a very long chapter to explaining that death is not the end of life for us because it was not the end of life for Jesus. And at the end of that chapter, like his big crescendo and his final statement, he takes Ecclesiastes head on and he says, therefore, because of resurrection, always excel in the work of the Lord, because you know that in the Lord, your labour is not vanity. It's not in vain. It's not meaningless. Your hard work matters if, and only if, your work matters if Jesus rose from the dead. And this speaks to what Paul said about his increased conviction in the necessity of the historical resurrection of the Lord Jesus. If Jesus broke open a new life for you, a new season under heaven, when God will bring every deed into judgment, then you can have meaning. We're coming up to Easter, and the stakes of Easter couldn't be higher. And I encourage you to get along to a church and to sit with the Easter story. Because if Easter morning is not true, then the last words of Ecclesiastes are wrong and the first words are right. And if Easter morning is true, then the first words are wrong and the last words are right. For God will bring every deed into judgment, including every hidden thing, whether it is good or evil. So we at St. James want to invite you to keep thinking about that, and to keep thinking about that among us or at a church that is more local to you. Tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. we're having a regular service. There's nothing peculiar about it, it's just what we do. We will come and worship, we will have Holy Communion, we will read the scriptures about the story of the bit of scripture we're up to, and we'll think about it. So come tomorrow, come on Easter Sunday, come Good Friday, come any and every Sunday. You're always welcome, whether you believe in it or not. Church is a place where it's okay to just sit and listen and think and object and feel awkward. You can do all that. God has set eternity in your heart, but you might have a lot of static going on, and we want to help you tune the dial and listen to what God is saying. Now, tomorrow night at 7 o'clock, we're doing something that is unusual. We're having an extra meeting here. It's a free meeting, and Paul is going to be speaking again. And this is something I hope that you'll come back to if you'd like to hear about this, and also bring your friends to. And I've asked Paul to speak on what can Jesus give me that Jordan Peterson can't. And so it's a direct plea or commendation of following Jesus. So please come, please bring your friends, because the wisdom of Jordan Peterson, I think, suffers the same constraints as the teacher in Ecclesiastes. He's working everything out without resurrection. And you can't make meaning that way. You need more. Warren's asked me to finish by praying for us, and I'd like to finish by praying a really old prayer for us. It's a really old Anglican prayer. It's in the 1662 or 1552 prayer book, and it's, I think, expresses perhaps what we all need. If you'd like it to be your prayer too, you can just say Amen at the end. I've updated the language a little bit. Let's pray. Almighty God, the fountain of all wisdom, who knows our needs before we ask and our ignorance in asking, we beg you to have compassion on our weaknesses and those things which for our unworthiness we dare not and for our blindness we cannot ask. Make sure to give us because of the worthiness of your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Thank you all for coming.